Okay, so tonight for our lecture series, I'd like to present to you Dr. Tamara Hunt. She's a professor of history at the University of Southern Indiana, where she teaches a very popular course called The Social History of Ghosts. She's been interested in ghost stories for many years and has collected more than 700 books about ghosts and related paranormal phenomena. No, she's never been on a ghost hunt or even a ghost tour. But yes, she has lived in a haunted house. So let's join in welcoming Dr. Hunt. There you go. Thank you.
Well, first, I want to thank you all for inviting me to come here tonight. I can't think of anything I'd rather do than talk about ghosts. So thank you for inviting me to come. Now, like many people, the people of Indiana are interested in ghost stories. And so what we're going to do tonight is look at some of these ghost stories and maybe introduce you to some that you haven't heard of so far. Now, in the 19th century, which is where we're going to begin, newspapers frequently reported ghost stories, apparitions, sightings, that kind of thing. And very often that was filler. Because think of it, these newspapers in the days, especially before they had news bureaus and rapid communications everywhere, they had to find something to fill up every edition of the paper. And very often what they did is they had columns of quirky little stories, which would often include ghosts. And so as a result, what we often find is ghost stories being included in the newspapers. So we're going to start by taking a look at some of these. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Before we get to the actual ghost stories, I want to explain something about why people became so interested in ghost stories in the 19th century. And a lot of that has to do with spiritualism. As many of you may know, spiritualism really has a point of origin. 1848 in upstate New York, where two sisters, the Fox sisters, said that they could communicate with the ghost of a murdered peddler in their home. And they did it through a series of coded raps. Well, people came from all over to see these sisters and hear the ghost answer questions about people and things. And soon the girls were on stage doing it for paying audiences. Well, this let loose a flood of people who proclaimed themselves to be mediums and who said that they could talk to the dead. And not surprisingly, this led very quickly to newspapers and journals based on spiritualism. And that's what you see here. The Spiritual Telegraph was one of the early newspapers that dealt with the paranormal, with ghosts and the like. And I just love the fact that in these newspapers, there are ads for mediums. So you can go and find a medium who addresses your particular problem. And I've only included two of them here, but I love this, that Mrs. S.B. Johnson, she'll diagnose and cure your disease if you send her $5, which in 1855 is a lot of money. So send it to her and she'll fix everything. And then we have Miss A. Sebring, who can do pretty much everything. Tipping, which means table tipping, rapping, singing, personating, and speaking medium. And she actually has regularly scheduled hours of 10 to 12, 2 to 5, and 7 to 9. And I'm assuming this is every day. So she's a 7-day-a-week medium who can do all kinds of different things. Well, all of this type of thing helped to spread interest in ghosts and ghost seeing. And add to the fact that after people attended seances, they learned they could go home and do the same thing at home. So table tipping and rapping all became, in effect, parlor games in a way. And people would try to contact ghosts that way. Indiana had its share of spiritualists. And in fact, in the 1880s, the Indiana Association of Spiritualists was formed. Now, some of you may be familiar with the location that they founded, which was Camp Chesterfield, which they founded in 1891. This is in Chesterfield, Indiana, which is just southwest of Muncie. This actually remains one of the few remaining communities of spiritualists that exist today. And the other two that I know of are Lilydale in New York and Cassadaga Spiritualist Camp in Florida. And you see here a picture of people gathered for a spiritualist session, apparently, at Camp Chesterfield. And you can go there to this day for spiritualist services. Now, I don't know if you all knew this, but Evansville had a spiritualist organization. And in fact, in 1893, they purchased the Good Shepherd Episcopal Church on 3rd Street, renaming it the Spiritualist Temple. And this is an image of a map, a detail map or perspective map from 1888. And that building that is circled is the building that became the Spiritualist Temple. Okay, now on to the ghost stories. The interest in ghosts was reflected in the mainstream press. And as I said, they often included these short stories. And these 3 that you see depicted here are fairly typical of the type of ghost stories you'd see included in newspapers in the 1880s. They generally don't provide a lot of details, such as, for example, who saw the apparition or where they saw it or anything along those lines, and particularly not explanations for the haunting. They simply said, oh, there was this ghost and people saw it, and that was the end of it. But these are really, really common, and this is just 3 examples of the type of things that you might see in the 1880s in newspapers. So now we'll go to a more specific story, a story from Newcastle, which if you know where Newcastle is, it's in northwestern Indiana. Now, I love this story because it has such great detail in it. The ghost had flames of fire darting from its lurid eyes and making a blood-curdling noise and having an icy breath. So great imagery that they've got going on here. But unlike many stories, this one actually does try to explain where this ghost came from. Now, the picture you see here of Newcastle High School is the Newcastle High School Park is where the ghost was apparently first seen. And if you look on a map of Newcastle from this time period, you'll find that the railroad goes right along the southern edge of the park around the school. And so their explanation of the ghost was that this was a drunken man who had been hit by a train and killed, and now he was back haunting the place where he died. I will say that that's actually fairly typical of the association of ghosts and trains. Trains were really dangerous in the 19th and early 20th century. People died by being hit by them. People died because they were on them and they crashed. And so the connection between ghosts and trains is actually fairly common in this time period. So there we have the Newcastle ghost. Here we have a ghost from Jeffersonville, over east of here. Now, this doesn't identify the eyewitnesses or the location with any specificity, except to say it's somewhere near Rose Hill School. But in this case, the ghost is both seen and heard. And in fact, the story tells us that the family became so used to it that they just kind of ignored it, whether they heard it or saw it. Now, what I want to point your attention to, though, is the very end of this story, because the last sentence tells us that people wanted to initially poo-poo this story, but then they say that because this story comes from one of the most intelligent and highly respected families in the city, you have to believe it. So it was the quality of the witnesses that they were saying that determined whether this was a story that should be believed or not. Now, in many cases, ghost stories were dismissed because of the people who were telling them. If they were people who were judged to be uneducated, ignorant, or superstitious, there was a tendency to just say, oh, yeah, right. And I will point out, I don't go into this in any detail here, but I will point out that when ghosts were reported by African Americans in this time period, they almost always were dismissed as being the figments of superstitious people's imagination. And we shouldn't be surprised at that during the era of Jim Crow, because this was, of course, another way to put African Americans in their place as a result of the stories that they were telling. Okay, on to another one. This is one up by Crown Point. Home is haunted by spook. This story is really interesting. I've only given you part of the actual newspaper account because this is actually a fairly lengthy account. And this ghost comes and sits on the bed and waves his hands over the person's face and all the rest of it. I did go and look up all the people who are mentioned in this story, and they all did exist. So this is based at least on people who really did live. But one of the things I don't understand is that this story suggests that the ghost is the ghost of William McGinnis, who was the former owner of the property. And I can't find any evidence that there's any reason he should be haunting this. He died not here, but at his son's house in 1903 of dysentery at age 75. So, and he'd had it for months. So it wasn't like this was a sudden death. It wasn't like it was a young death. I don't see any suggestion that he was murdered. So it's not really clear to me why they think he should be coming back and haunting his old farm, but clearly they think that that's the case. So now on to another one. This is the story of a Warsaw, Indiana butcher, a man named William Hull. This story is fairly gruesome because somebody apparently attacked him with an axe in the face. And then they put his body by the railway tracks in hopes that a train would run over him and hide the fact that he'd been murdered. Well, he apparently was found before that point. People realized he'd been murdered, and just over a month later, they're reporting that he's back as a ghost. 2 night watchers who patrol that section of the road where the murdered man was found have given up their position, having seen the ghost. So these men were so frightened by it that they quit. Well, I actually think that there's a better reason. There's a better reason for him to come back. And that's because they did arrest and try someone for the murder. It was a man named John Schaefer. He was tried in April of 1883 for the murder. We'll deal with our technical difficulties here. Yay! It works. It's like that. It's alive. So, okay. Well, John Schaefer was tried and found guilty of Hull's murder in April of 1883. And this is the reason why I think that William Hull's ghost should have come back. He's sentenced to 4 years for the murder of William Hull in this horrible way. And according to the Indianapolis Journal story, shortly after the trial, the strange verdict is sharply criticized. No kidding, 4 years for taking an axe to this guy. Okay, so brief survey of some ghosts in Indiana, and now we're going to turn to actual Evansville ghost. Some of these stories may be ones that you haven't heard before, and I certainly hope so. Now, this one is interesting. This is a story from 1910 that reports that there's a glowing tombstone in an old cemetery, and they don't specifically name the cemetery, but from where it's described as being, I think it has to be Mount Sinai Cemetery by Rodenberg Road. And they said that in the middle of the cemetery, there's a tombstone that glows at night, and you can only see it if you're far away from it, but if you get close to it, the glow disappears. Well, this is actually not an unusual type of phenomenon to be reported. There are accounts of glowing tombstones in various places. For example, in March of 1901, the San Francisco Call newspaper reported that there were glowing tombstones in the mining country in Utah. And they explained that this was the work of the ghost of miner Sandy McGovern, who had been blown to bits in an explosion. And so he haunted the cemetery, and not surprisingly, he haunted the mine as well. But glowing tombstones, okay, I don't mean to put rain on anybody's parade or anything, but glowing tombstones at this time, I have to wonder about this. And it would be interesting to see if they had recently installed street lights, because street lights reflecting that's a possibility. So I'm going to probably dig into this one a little bit further and see if I can find out if there's some kind of lighting that was put in around the cemetery. Now, a ghost in downtown Evansville. Anybody in here ever heard of the ghost of Josie Gray? Okay, well, Josie Gray. Josie Gray worked as a bookkeeper for the R&G Furniture Company on Main Street. And this was one of the biggest furniture companies in the city at the time. On Saturday, March 16th, 1907, she stayed behind as she normally did to tally up the books for the day's sales. Everybody else went home and she was there by herself, or so she thought. But sometime in the evening, she was attacked and beaten. Now, Josie lived with her mother and father, and when she didn't return home at the normal time she would have, her father, the Reverend James Gray, went looking for her, and ultimately he found her beaten and locked in the vault in the furniture store. So the big safe that they had in there, she was inside it. She was alive but unconscious, and she was rushed to the hospital. Police hoped that she would wake up and be able to identify her attacker. So this story really caught national attention. And there are newspapers all over the country that are reporting on this attack. You see here the Chicago Daily Tribune and the Louisville Courier-Journal, but this was also reported in Boston, Massachusetts. It was reported in Wapaton, North Dakota. And my husband used to live in North Dakota, and I asked him where this is, and he said he didn't know. So there's some place in North Dakota that reported this. Most newspapers stressed the 2 points that you see here. A, that she was locked in the safe after she was attacked, and B, that she was a girl or even a young girl. I find that second point really, really interesting because it's clear that they wanted to draw on the public's heartstrings to feel sorry for this. I mean, we should feel sorry for anybody who's attacked and locked in a safe. But they were playing this up even more to send the idea that this was a young and innocent girl who was attacked. And the problem with that is that even though Chicago Tribune says that Josie was 19, in reality, she was 40. So she's not a young girl when this attack happens. Well, for nearly a month, Josie hung on in the hospital, and newspapers in the region reported her progress. In some cases, they said, "Oh, there's hope that she's going to recover." In others, they said, "Oh, we think she's going to die without ever regaining consciousness." And they go on about this back and forth. All they had to do was say Josie Gray, and everybody knew who this was. It was reported that shortly before she died, because she did in fact pass away, she answered her mother's question, "Who did it?" And she supposedly said Guy Prescott. Now, Guy Prescott had been a porter who worked at the store, and coincidentally or not, he disappeared the night that she was attacked. Never seen again. And the interesting thing is that for more than a year after she died, newspapers around the country are reporting that somebody has seen Prescott. So this story stayed in the national consciousness to a certain extent for people who had read about it. Okay, so where's the ghost in this? This is the interesting part of this ghost. This story actually has the headline, "Some Excuse for Poor Service." And it's a running joke that at this time, telephone service was bad. And so what they're saying here is that there's some excuse for poor service because the telephone operators are seeing a ghost. Now, I haven't gone to check this out, but I'm assuming that this building on Sycamore Street was back to back with the furniture store, and that the telephone operators, the people in the furniture store didn't report a ghost, but the telephone operators did. And I think that the reason they're reporting it is because they're there at night. They were there overnight. The people in the furniture store went home in the evening. And in any case, they were reporting that they saw lights and a figure flitting across the back of the furniture store, which of course was where Josie had been attacked. And you notice that this is 4 years after her death. So there's still this very clear consciousness of this crime. And it's being reported that her ghost has come back. So the ghost of Josie Gray. And by the way, if anyone who is listening to this tonight, if you have heard further reports of the ghost of Josie Gray, send me a note so I know about it, okay? Here's another story about Evansville, and it's the ghost of Henry Place. I love this story. When I found this one, it was like, yay, because it's such fun. I mean, okay, it has a death in it, so I'm not going to crow about that, but the ghost story itself is interesting. Henry Place died after being electrocuted, and he had been helping to set up a barbecue for his friends. And the night of the barbecue, his mother had, somewhat unusually for her, asked him not to go out. And he's, Mom, it's okay. I'm just going to go hang out with my friends. Well, unfortunately, as they were setting up for this barbecue outside, they ran an extension cord, which was frayed, and he ended up touching the live wire. The coroner later said that if he had not already had a weak heart, he probably would have survived it. But as it was, he died. So the family was really devastated by this because Henry was their primary financial support. His mother was a widow and he had 4 younger siblings, and this was a really terrible incident for them. So Mrs. Place missed her son Henry, and apparently she believed that she could contact him through the use of talking board, which we now today universally call a Ouija board, or a spirit board, or a witch board. Ouija is actually the brand name of a type of talking board that was first introduced in 1891. Well, the Ouija board is actually a development from what was known as the planchette. You can see the illustration of the planchette on the left. And the planchette was basically a heart-shaped board that had 2 wheels on the wide end of it and a pencil sticking through on the narrow end of it. And what you did is, like you see here, you put your hand on it, and the spirits were supposed to guide your hand and write words. So the idea is the spirits were communicating that way. Well, someone came up with the idea that maybe it would be more efficient, because the ghost handwriting was sometimes hard to read. Maybe it would be more efficient if we had a board and let them spell it out. And so that's what they did. They created this talking board. So Mrs. Place tried to contact Henry using a talking board. And this is what she was doing in August of 1917. She and her daughter, Margaret, they lived together at 811 John Street. They rented the house there. They were working with the Ouija board, hoping to contact Henry. And according to the story, during their seance, a cool breeze suddenly went through the room, and the Ouija board began to spell out a message that said, "Look out for Nat and Barb." The ladies, of course, recognized the names, and you can see why. Nathaniel Moxley and his wife Barbara lived literally across the street from them. And when Mrs. Place then asked if this was Henry who was sending this message, the board replied, "Yes, look out for Nat and Barb." Well, at this point, according to the story, Mrs. Place shook her finger at the Ouija board and told Henry to stop talking that way about the Moxleys. She's scolding him for saying these nasty things. But despite the scolding, Henry wouldn't say anything else except look out for Nat and Barb. Okay, are you ready for the next slide? This is the one that I found that set me onto this story, okay? Now, what happens is that they put the board away and they go to bed, and Mrs. Place turns out the light and goes and lays down. And the next thing she hears is some scratching under her bed. And she thinks, that's not the cat. What is that? So she gets up to turn a light on, and she no sooner does that than Nat Moxley comes out from under her bed and flees the house. So he was hiding under the bed the whole time this seance was going on. On his way out, he dropped a paper that was a summons to appear as a witness, so they had proof that he'd been in their house. The women returned to the Ouija board to see if Henry had anything to add, and he did. He said, "I told you to look out for Nat and Barb." This story obviously caught the public's attention, and it was reported in a variety of newspapers across the country. But there's one part of this story that the newspapers didn't report, but me being a historian looking into it, I found this out, and I actually think this is kind of scary. In 1920, Nathaniel Moxley was a patient in the Southern Indiana Hospital for the Insane. This is the guy who's under her bed that Henry was saying, look out for. And I wonder, did Henry know more about Nat than he let on? So at any rate, so the story of the haunting of Henry Place. Okay, now this to me is the best part of it, because this is where I get to take apart some of these ghost stories and show you how they're all a bunch of lies. So that's the historian in me saying that, okay, because that's what we do. Ghost stories are really fun. I mean, I think you guys can tell I really enjoy doing this, and it's loads of fun. But even the ones that are told as true or real are in fact largely fiction. And I can't understand that, because given the resources on the internet, it's relatively easy to find out if details in ghost stories are factual. It's just not that hard to do. And this is one of the things I always tell my students, because remember, I'm a professor of history. I always tell my students that if you can't get the easy things right that anybody can check, why should we believe you about the stuff that's hard to check? So if you can't get the details right about the people involved and the places involved, why should we believe you that there's a ghost? And by the way, as Jennifer said in the introduction, I did live in a haunted house, so obviously I do believe in ghosts. So this is not to say that they don't exist. Okay. All right. Now, if anything weird happens in the next few minutes, we're going to know why, because I'm going to talk about the gray lady who is supposed to be in this building. Okay. So hopefully she'll let us get through this without any problems. I have done a lot of research on the gray lady, and I've reproduced up here this story that is from River City Weekend. And it says that the gray lady is supposed to be Louise Carpenter, the daughter of Willard Carpenter, who gave the money to found this institution. And this story says, when Willard Carpenter passed away, he left the entirety of his estate to his businesses and the library. Louise Carpenter sued the library board for what she thought was hers, claiming that her father was not in a sound state of mind when he wrote his last will and testament. Louise Carpenter lost the case. Now she's believed to haunt the library until she gets what is owed. Okay, there are factual errors in that story, and I'm going to show you what they are right now. The idea that Willard Carpenter left the entirety of his estate to his businesses in the library and that her father was not in a sound state of mind when he wrote his last will and testament. First problem, he died without a will. You can't disinherit somebody and leave them out of your will if you don't have a will. He didn't have a will. And I'm researching this, so I'm not saying that this is the last word on this, but it looks to me like what he did is he turned all of his property, his real estate, and it was extensive. He turned it over to his wife, Lucina, by 1878. And the Vanderburgh County probate order books bear this out, that she had the property, he didn't. And I think that he may not have written a will, because if he'd written a will, he'd have to show that he was basically broke. His wife had all the money. And in fact, the estate, Willard's estate, was declared insolvent in 1885, but Lucina's estate had plenty of money, and property after property were being sold out of her estate. Now, Louise did sue the trustees of the Willard Library, but not over the will. It was over the original grant made in 1876. So there are some factual errors. I mean, it sounds really great that she's mad because she was left out of a will, but she wasn't. And she wasn't left out of her mother's will either. So my question is Louise the ghost? And this, by the way, is from the ghost cams here in the library. So if you're interested, you can check those out. Well, Louise ultimately moved to Massachusetts with one of her daughters, and she died and was buried there. So she's not buried here. Her name is on the Carpenter Monument in Oak Hill Cemetery, which, by the way, cost $439 more than was authorized to be spent for it. And Lucina's administrator had to go and get permission to the court to pay for it. So they went all out on it. Okay, so if she died in 1908, and the first report of the Gray Lady was in 1937, my question is, what took her so long? Why did she wait nearly 30 years? And for that reason, and also because she seems to be a very pleasant, benign kind of ghost, and there's an odor of perfume, and she turns on water and moves chairs, but nothing bad, nothing gets thrown as far as I know. Nothing gets thrown? Okay, Willard Library people, like, okay, nothing gets thrown.
Things get thrown all the time.
Well,
That's something else.
okay, all right, well, then maybe it still is the librarians who are mad about the way things are going here, because there were actually 2 female librarians who worked in this building for over 30 years each, Tilly Gosley and Catherine Imbush. And you notice that Catherine Imbush in particular died in 1930. These 2 women worked at the library almost up until the day they died. And so I would suggest that perhaps it's one of these 2 librarians as opposed to Louise. And I don't know. And I don't know how we're ever going to prove it one way or another, but I'd like to suggest that perhaps there's an alternative explanation. Now, the Willard Library isn't the only one in Indiana that is supposedly haunted. And this is a photograph I found of the Indiana State Library. This is their history research room. And it sure looks to me like there are 2 transparent figures in this photograph. Okay. Now, what I found interesting is that I've given you the citation of the place where I found this photograph. This is an article that was written by 2 men. One of whom is a professor of sociology at Indiana University, and the other is a retired librarian who worked at this library for years. Now, what I find really interesting is that they use all kinds of print records and photographic records to build their case about this library. But it's only when they come to this photograph that they raise any questions about, well, can we really accept this as being something that's a valid piece of evidence? And they go at some length about this. They say, well, you know, this photo was taken by a paranormal group, and you know that paranormal groups are always out there looking for paranormal phenomenon. So of course this has to be questionable, and it could be a trick of light with all that light coming in. I mean, they say this stuff in the article. I'm sorry. Now, I would want to know, has this photograph been examined to see if it's been doctored? Because if anything, I would say this looks like it's a type of double exposure. If it's not the real thing, then that's what I'd want to know. But I just thought it was really interesting that the authors of that article accepted all the other kinds of evidence, but not this one. This one they found objectionable. Okay, Oscar the Friendly Ghost. This is a very recent one. I found this in the newspaper for a newspaper of the Times Mail of Bedford in 1980. This is the story. This family said that they had a ghost who moved with them from their house on Harriet Street to a new residence. And they said that they had been at the Harriet Street residence for 25 years. And during that time, they had a ghost who did things like flush the toilet and open and close doors and walk up and down the stairs. And in fact, the wife of the family said that she'd actually seen him, that he was a tall young man who was fairly husky. And the thing is that they tell this story about why they call this ghost Oscar. They say that this is a young man who died in the home before they moved into it, and his name had been Oscar. So of course, being a historian, I said, okay, let's go see if there are any Oscars who lived in this house. And there are 2 of them. This is the death certificate for Oscar Knoll. He was a railroad mail clerk who died in 1929 of a brain tumor at age 54. But there are some problems. He doesn't fit the story very well. First of all, his family owned the house. So he wasn't a boarder, he was a family member. He wasn't very tall, and they described the ghost as being a tall young man. So he's only 5'6", according to his World War I draft induction records. And then he's also not a young man. He was 54. And in this time period, 1929, 54 is not young. It's not even middle-aged. Boy, I'm glad that's not the case anymore. And then in addition to that, he didn't die of unexplained causes at home. He died in the hospital because of a brain tumor. So he apparently doesn't fit. But what about the other Oscar? This Oscar seems to be far more likely. We can see from his World War II draft records that he was in fact a boarder at the house on Harriet Street, that he was 28 years old, that he was a tall young man. He was 5 feet 10.5 inches tall, 144 pounds. Sounds like he's kind of thin, but on the other hand, he's a construction worker, so maybe he was husky. So it might seem that, oh, well, this is the Oscar. Okay, here's the problem. When that story was told in 1980, this guy was still alive. He didn't die until 1996. So no Oscar here. Well, so I think that what happened is what often happens with ghost stories. There's a little bit of truth that gets mixed in with the story and it makes a good story. So they're going to go ahead and say, well, yeah, this is the way it is. And to be perfectly frank with you, the house that I lived in that we thought was haunted, we thought it was haunted by a ghost named Chester, who was the man who built the house. We had no evidence whatsoever to say that it was Chester. But the next door neighbor said, yeah, that sounds like Chester. So we accepted that. We had a ghost named Chester. That's the way that these things happen. But there's no excuse for what comes next. There are people who write and sell books on ghost stories. And in this particular book by Dennis William Houck, Haunted Places, the National Directory, he includes the story of Oscar the Ghost. And he adds details that weren't in the newspaper story that was based on an interview with the people who lived in the house. He says that this ghost was a lonely 19-year-old and that he had died after that he had, let me see, I've lost my place here. Oh, that he died in 1922. And that one of the things he liked to do was rock his cane bottom rocker. Well, that wasn't mentioned in the story. Being 19 years old wasn't mentioned in the story. Dying in 1922 wasn't mentioned in the story. So where these details come from, I don't know. But as I said, there's no account of a death at this residence and certainly not somebody named Oscar. Yet there it is presented in this book as this is a real ghost story, real made up ghost story is. Okay, now the final story, when I came across this story, I actually said, this is too good to be true, which of course immediately sent me out to research it. And you can read the story at the top here. This is from the website Only in Your State. And you see what the story is. This is the basic outlines of the story. Man has a telephone installed in his tomb in case he's buried alive. Years later, his wife dies of a stroke and she's found clutching the phone in her hand. And when they took and buried her, they found the phone in the tomb off the hook. Okay, that is too good to be true. Too good to be true. Okay, and I love the fact that this, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the wrong tomb. This is not the tomb of Martin and Susan Sheets. It's the tomb of somebody named Minshall. So they don't even have the tomb, the right picture. Okay, now some of you may be familiar with Troy Taylor. He's a well-known Illinois ghost hunter. He's written a lot of books on ghosts. And I will say this for him, I have read a number of these because he at least writes well or has a good editor. So they're at least fun to read. Well, he adds some details about the story about Martin Sheets in his book, In the Boneyard. he says that Martin Sheets had installed the phone sometime before he died in 1910. Keep that date in mind. He left money in his will to pay for the remaining time for maintaining the line. And Taylor says that Susan died years later and was found with the old telephone clutched so tightly in her hand that they had to pry it loose. The family assumed that she had made a mistake when trying to call for help, grabbing the mausoleum phone instead of the house phone. And of course, when the family went to lay her to rest in the tomb, they found the phone off the hook. So he adds some more detail, but it's the same basic story. She's found dead with the phone. They go to the tomb, the phone is off the hook. All right. Now this one, I almost had to hold my nose at this one. This is David Jolly's self-published book, Ghosts of the Wabash. Now, his story is that Mrs. Sheets was the one who put the telephone in the tomb because she couldn't bear to be separated from her husband. And that after her husband died, she spent hours on the phone talking to who knows what. This is the phone connected to the mausoleum. Her children, according to David Jolly, her children became so concerned that they sent her to a psychiatrist who institutionalized her for 10 years. The night after she was released and came home, supposedly cured, she was resting in her room when the now disconnected phone began to ring. Minutes later, her maid found her dead on the floor, the phone clenched in one hand, the other hand on her chest, and a look of horror on her face. Okay, it gets better. All right. 2 days later, when the family opened the tomb to lay her to rest, they found the husband's coffin burst from within and his body missing. And of course, the phone was off the hook. Okay. When I read that one, I thought, all right, now, if this had really happened and the body was missing, don't you think somebody would have reported that in the newspapers? Not a word. Okay. So let's check the facts. All right. Is there even a telephone in the tomb? Yes, apparently there was. Now, Martin Sheets built that tomb in 1910, but he did not die until 1926. So Troy Taylor gets the date of his death wrong. But right after he was died, newspapers across the country carried these stories, some of them quite lengthy, about the fact that he had put a telephone in his tomb and supposedly a bottle of whiskey as well, just in case he had to wait a while before somebody came to rescue him. So this was carried across the country, and apparently in all seriousness, there were people who talked about this telephone that was installed in the tomb. So yes, there was a telephone in the tomb, although they do get the date of his death wrong. Now, David Jolly tells us that after Martin's death, Susan's children became so concerned that they sent her to a psychiatrist and had her locked up. All right, how about if we take a look at that good old thing, the US Census? The census of 1910 actually lists how many children a woman had and how many were living at the time of the census. And that's what's circled in red at the end there. She had 1 child born and 0 child living. So in 1910, no children. So when they say her children were so concerned that they sent her to a psychiatrist, what children? If it really was her children, we're talking about another ghost story here. Had to be the ghost of that child who died. All right, so the facts about the children are not correct. Now, David Jolly and to some extent Troy Taylor would have us believe that Mrs. Sheets was highly distraught over her husband's death. But as you can see from this newspaper from 1928, she sued his estate. And if you notice, it says, the will of Sheets bequeathed the bulk of his fortune to charitable institutions. And she apparently thought that she needed more from that estate. Now, I actually have spent a good part of my time looking through the Vigo County probate records, and they do have the records of wills. I have not been able to find his will, but I would be interested to see it because it could very well be that he has some uncomplimentary things to say about his wife, because it's not uncommon for people who don't like their family members to say so in their wills. So I would be interested to see that. But at any rate, she sues. Now, does this sound like a woman who is so distraught about her husband's death that she's on the phone to him? Or, well, maybe it is, because she's on the phone to him saying, "Where's my money?" So, okay. And then finally, she dies with the phone in her hand of a stroke. Sorry, no. She gets hit by a car and dies while she's visiting in Illinois. No phone, no stroke, no heart attack. She gets hit by a car. So all that stuff that was in those books and was on the website is absolutely not true. It's made up. And it's okay to make up those stories, but don't tell us that they're real or that they're true. This, by the way, is a picture of the real tomb. So yes, this is the Martin and Susan Sheets tomb. They're buried there along with their infant daughter, who had died several decades before they did, that in the 1880s. Was the phone off the hook? Who knows? It could have been. I don't know. There might be a way for squirrels or something to get in there and knock it off. It might be off the hook. Who knows? But was the coffin burst open and his body missing? Again, I say, if that was the case, don't you think somebody would have said something about it at the time? That really strikes me as something that would be a remarkable occurrence. And even if it wasn't supernatural, wouldn't people want to know if there were grave robbers or vandals or something? I mean, in this very same cemetery, I don't know if you guys have ever heard the story of Stiffy the dog, Stiffy Green, the dog, which is actually a real story. There was another man about this time who had a favorite dog who he just loved. And when the man died, the dog went and supposedly stayed outside the tomb. And when the dog died, the widow had him stuffed and put inside the tomb. And this created a lot of problems because when they taxidermied him, they put in a reflective material in his eyes. So kids would come out to the cemetery and go and peer through the doors to see if they could see the dog's eyes glowing. And finally, somebody actually took a shot at Stiffy Green and his face got a little messed up. So he's now actually in the County Historical Society, and you can go to their website and they have a picture of him there. So there was actually this dog. But so if they could report on that, why would they not report on a coffin being burst open and a body being gone? Sorry, that just doesn't sound reasonable to me. So anyway, I think as you can see, I had way too much fun doing this when I probably should have been grading papers or something, but this was more fun. And if any of you have any ghost stories, or if I've said anything that isn't correct, please let me know so that I can fix it, because I'm a historian and we always want to be accurate in what we say. And if you have any ghost stories you want to pass along to me, I'd love to hear them. This is my contact information. You can reach me through USI. And thank you so much for your attention.